Hi, I'm Rick Newman, Executive Director at the American Museum of Tort Law, with another in our continuing series of interesting talks on interesting topics with interesting people, all pertaining to some aspect of the law. Our guest today is Professor Michael White, who is a professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University, as well as Associate Director of ASU's Center for Violence Prevention and Community Safety. He's a nationally known expert in police body-worn cameras, and that is today's topic, which has been in the news lately. It's important, it's relevant, it's timely, it's germane. It's Michael White. Welcome. Glad to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, let's talk a little bit. We were just talking before we started recording this thing. I've always used the term police cams, but in fact, there are at least two kinds. There are police body-worn cameras, which we're going to be talking about, but police also have dashboard cameras in their police vehicles, right? So the distinction, I guess, is important because the dashboard camera can only capture what's right in front of the car, whereas the body-worn camera goes where the officer goes, basically.
Yeah,
so
that's
how
right.
widespread are these cameras? How prevalent are they, body-worn cameras?
You know, it's a good question, and it's only been recently that we've gotten some, I think, some accurate data on how common these cameras are. I guess the first thing we should recognize is that there are close to 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. So there are just thousands of police departments out there. In many cases, these departments are very small. We often think of the big departments that are in the TV, in TV shows and the movies like the NYPD, LAPD. But the bottom line is that more than half of police departments in this country have fewer than 10 officers. So given the sheer number of agencies, it's difficult, or it's been difficult to get a handle on how many have adopted cameras. And the U.S. Department of Justice did a survey back in 2016, and they just released the results, I guess it was about 2 years later in 2018. And they asked police departments if they had deployed cameras to at least some of their officers, and just under half, it was 47%. So yes, they had deployed some cameras, and this was back in 2016, so long before the summer of 2020, which is really you think about what's been happening recently in policing. It's the death of George Floyd and some other really controversial cases last year that have really pushed this forward. So I think if it was just under half in 2016, it's got to be approaching 2/3 by now. So there are many thousands of police departments across the country that have deployed these cameras.
And what is the hope or the perceived benefit of body-worn cameras? Why deploy them? Why use them?
There are a couple of different primary goals, and the initial kind of surge in the adoption of these cameras happened back after 2014, after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, in August of 2014. That case, as well as some others, really led to a big push for this technology. The White House, the U.S. Department of Justice, in early 2015 really began to advocate for cameras. So one of the big goals that departments seek when they adopt cameras is to avoid becoming the next Ferguson, or more recently the next Minneapolis. They want to show transparency to to their constituents. They want to have a tool that can provide accountability. And a third goal that's becoming much more I think much more relevant and timely is probably one that's more interesting for this audience, is the evidentiary value of the cameras, not just for police departments that are trying to understand what may have happened in a police citizen encounter, but evidentiary value that then can inform prosecutors' decisions on whether to charge or not, and what charge to pursue. And then even further downstream, evidence that can be used by judges, by juries to make decisions about guilt or innocence. And we saw that with the Derek Chauvin trial. That body-worn camera footage was instrumental in in that criminal trial.
Yeah, and it also, I guess, could be perceived by police officers as a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it documents their actions so they can withstand claims of abuse or excessive force. And on the other hand, it documents their actions so they can be held liable against claims of abuse or excessive force. Are there standardized rules in using them, when they're turned on, whether they can be turned off in mid-action, whether they can be edited? How do we track what they're gathering?
Yeah, one of the first things the department needs to do if they're going to deploy body-worn cameras is to develop a very clear, detailed administrative policy. And that policy will provide guidance to officers on the things that you just mentioned. When should it be activated? Should citizens be notified that they're being recorded? Can it be turned off temporarily? When should it be turned off? In general, who gets to access it and when? So should an officer be able to review their footage before they're completing reports, or maybe getting ready for court testimony for a case that was months and months ago? So really, the argument that I've made for years now is that a good body-worn camera policy is the foundation of a good body-worn camera program. So it has to start with a clear, detailed policy that tells officers what is expected of them and what they shouldn't be doing. And then the back end piece of that is it has to be enforced. So if there are police officers who are violating the policy, they're not activating when they're supposed to, maybe they're not notifying citizens when they're supposed to, whatever it is, there needs to be follow-up so that officers understand that if they violate that policy, whether it be intentionally or not, that they're going to have to, they're going to be asked about that, and they're going to have to account for their actions.
So there is then, I gather, no national standard for programs using police body cameras. Each department creates its own.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, Rick. One of the things that I do, in addition to my academic hat, is I work with the U.S. Department of Justice. They have a grant funding program that was started by then President Obama back in 2015, and it's run through the U.S. Department of Justice, and they provide funding for agencies that want to deploy body-worn cameras. So it's money for cameras, and they have funded more than 400 police departments, and for an agency that gets federal money, they get a team that I'm part of. We call it a training and technical assistance team. I'm the co-director of this team, and it's a support system to make sure that agencies that get federal money have all the resources they need to be successful. And one of the key features of this work that we do is helping agencies with policy. We actually have a policy review process that any agency that gets money goes through. And when they get the grant, they can access 10% of their funds immediately. But they can't get the remaining 90% until they go through this policy review process that we've developed. So it's key that they have a really detailed policy, and we make sure that they do. But to get to your question about whether there's uniformity, the review process that we use for the Department of Justice is not prescriptive at all. So we don't tell agencies what they should say about activation or citizen notification or officer authority to review. We just make sure that their policy covers that. And the Department of Justice, their position is that these are issues that need to be determined locally by the chief, working with the line officers, with the union, working with the community, working with local stakeholders. They together can make decisions about the specifics of the policy. But because of that, you end up seeing quite a bit of variation in some cases on a specific policy issue. And some of the more controversial ones, it really does, it varies quite a bit, and it can be quite controversial. If there's a shooting, and I'm thinking of the Stephon Clark case in Sacramento, where Nobody had really thought about what it meant to mute the audio. But those officers, after they shot and killed Stefan Clark, they muted the audio of their cameras. And they did it because they were going to discuss the case and the investigation, and that was standard practice. But the community was outraged that had happened. And there wasn't really any guidance up until that point about what circumstances is it acceptable to mute audio, and how do you explain that? So I guess my point is that there's tremendous variation across these policy issues, and some of this is crisis driven. Something bad happens, and then we realize, well, this is a gap we haven't really thought about with regard to policy. We better address that, and then it's changed, and then we move forward.
Has there been any study about whether the wearing of body cameras has reduced allegations of police misconduct or abuse? Is the awareness that they're on camera, so to speak, reining in excessive force?
That's been one of the key areas that researchers have focused on, and I refer to it, and other people have referred to it, as a proposed civilizing effect. That is, the fact that the camera is present at a police-citizen encounter, it will change the behavior of both participants for the better. They know they're being watched, they know they're being observed, and that knowledge will change how people act. And there's some strong theoretical support for that, from psychology, from deterrence in criminology. But the question is whether and how that plays out. And if you think about it, citizens. So, is there a civilizing effect on citizen behavior? Well, there are many citizens who interact with the police are in no state of mind to understand the fact that they're being recorded and then change their behavior as a result. In some cases, they're victims of crime and they've been traumatized. In many cases, police interact with people who are mentally ill and in crisis. Police interact with people who are intoxicated. So, I have questions about whether there can be a civilizing effect with citizens. I think it's more likely that there is with police officers. And again, a key feature of that is, and we saw this with the Minneapolis case, because obviously it didn't affect those police officers when when the Chauvin was kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. They were recording the whole time, and it didn't seem to bug them at all. And I believe that's because they didn't think they were going to have to answer for those actions. But I think if there is accountability on the back end, and if the department's paying attention to all of this video that's being recorded, and they're auditing it, and they're looking for indications of police malpractice, that it can change officer behavior. And there have been about 30 studies that have specifically looked at the impact of complaints or the impact of body-worn cameras on citizen complaints, which is one of the indicators of police misbehavior. Citizen files a complaint, and more than 3/4 of those studies have shown that after a department deploys cameras, there are significant reductions in complaints against officers. That would seem to indicate that it's at least possible that officers are changing the behavior. There have been about 25 studies that have looked at the impact of cameras on use of force generally, of which some portion would be excessive force. Of course, there are many times when police officers are legally authorized to use force. And about half of those studies have shown declines in use of force after cameras are deployed. So I think there's pretty good evidence that it can change behavior. But again, the key piece is going to have to be the back end, the accountability.
Well, that leads to the next question, which is, how do people get access to the footage? First of all, are there standards for preserving it? Are there standards for access to it? And what about the ongoing investigation defense that says we can't release these films because there's an ongoing investigation?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most controversial issues with this technology right now is if there's a critical incident, whether it be a pursuit, a use of force, an officer-involved shooting, it's captured on body-worn camera. Who gets to see that and when? And what's interesting is that many police chiefs. I don't know how many press conferences I've seen where a chief of police says, we're adopting body-worn cameras and we're doing it because we want to be transparent to you and we've got nothing to hide. And then fast forward a few years later, there's a critical incident, there's a shooting, and the community now expects that video to be released. And it's the opportunity for a chief to deliver on that promise that he or she made about being transparent, and it doesn't happen. And you can understand the community's outrage when that happens. Mm-hmm. And there has been, you want to talk about variation, there has been significant variation in how chiefs handle this. I'm thinking of the incident in Columbus, Ohio last month with the shooting of the 16-year-old girl. That chief of police released that video within hours of mm-hmm. the incident. The Las Vegas Metro Police Department, they have a policy of releasing footage within 72 hours. And you want to talk about two extremes. The state of California has actually passed a law that requires that departments release footage of critical incidents within 45 days. So it gives them some period of time to go through that investigation. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got the state of North Carolina, which has essentially prohibited the release of any body cam footage unless there's a court order. And there have been cases where chiefs of police in North Carolina want to release footage, but under state law, they're not allowed to. They have to petition the court, and a judge has to essentially approve the release. And as we saw in a recent case, a judge in North Carolina actually said, no, you cannot release that footage. And one of the primary explanations that we often get is that release of the footage will somehow impair or negatively affect an ongoing criminal investigation. And in 2021, I'm not sure I'm buying that argument anymore. There's I understand the kind of more traditional rationale for the ongoing investigation explanation, but I think where we are now in 2021 with the community expectations and the kind of state of police community relations, I think the need to release that footage far outweighs any concerns about an ongoing investigation.
Where do police unions come down on the issue of body-worn cameras? They have often in the past defended officers who have been accused of lots of bad conduct, repeated claims of excessive force, because the union is protecting the officers. So do they have a position on body-worn cameras, or is it multifaceted?
I think it's multifaceted, and it's changed over time. I think it's fair to say back in 2013, 2014, just as the momentum was picking up with this technology, most unions opposed it. In fact, the union in the Boston Police Department actually filed an injunction in federal court trying to stop the leadership from deploying cameras. But as time passed, I also think it's fair to say that unions have been more open to the technology, and in large part because I think what they've realized is that the footage is far more likely to show that the officer didn't do anything wrong than it is to show that they did do something wrong. So it ends up being more of a protection against frivolous complaints filed against officers than it does getting them in trouble. And I think that has resulted in kind of a sea change in unions' response to the technology. Now, they still have concerns, about supervisor fishing expeditions, supervisors going and just reviewing video to try to jam up an officer, get an officer in trouble. So there are still ongoing concerns that unions have, but for the most part, I think they've embraced the technology now because they see it more as a protection than as something that's going to hurt the officers.
And how do body cameras interact with the fact that every citizen these days is filming everything? They have their cell phones out at the drop of a hat. Is there any discussion about the interrelationship between the body-worn cameras and citizen films?
I think for some chiefs of police, they've use that as a way to overcome some of the resistance they may be seeing among officers by simply saying, look, you're being recorded by just about everybody, whether it be a citizen cell phone, a traffic camera, a surveillance camera at a local convenience store. Everything you do is being recorded. You might as well wear this camera and capture your perspective of things now and capture the whole event. So I know many chiefs have used that as kind of an opportunity to overcome at least some initial officer resistance to the cameras. And when I talk to judges and prosecutors about body-worn camera footage, their response in some cases has just been a bit of a shrug of the shoulders. Yeah, we've had this kind of camera footage for years because of cell phones, because of surveillance cameras. Now we have more of it because all police officers in, say, a certain area are wearing departments and or wearing cameras and are generating footage, and some of that footage then will be used. So they have to account for that in terms of resources. But in terms of just being used to footage, it's not that big of a deal. Now it's just a kind of an increased volume of that footage. And whether it's coming from a citizen cell phone or a police officer body camera, I think most prosecutors, most courts are just kind of treating those as coming together. And again, we can look at the George Floyd murder trial. Most people have seen the citizen cell phone footage with the incident leading to George Floyd's death. But there was all this body-worn camera footage too that most people haven't seen. But they both were important for the for the criminal trial.
Right. Have there been any, or has there been any litigation about body camera footage disappearing or being edited or modified? You mentioned the one where they had muted the sound. How do these things get played out, if they've ever played out?
There are, by now, I think there are more than 60 companies that make this technology, and the major vendors, which would include Axon, which is the former Taser International company, Panasonic, and some other big ones. The systems that they devise are essentially tamper-proof. Most of the big vendors offer a cloud-based storage system, so the department is essentially uploading footage into the cloud, and you can access it, but they have very clear, detailed audit trails. So if I've recorded something on my camera and I want to delete it because it captures me using foul language or doing something that I wasn't supposed to be doing, it's going to be very difficult for me to do that, and really impossible for me to do that without leaving a paper trail that I've edited footage. The deletion of footage can happen, but again, I'm going to have to answer for that if I delete a video that generated a citizen complaint or a use of force. Those are automatic reviews of footage. So my supervisor is going to go looking for that. And when it's not there, I'm going to be in big trouble. And then also, like I said, a lot of this is handled in policy. I've read probably 500-600 administrative policies on body-worn camera footage or body-worn camera policy and programs. And every single one of them will have language that prohibits an officer from copying, editing, tampering with. All of those are taken very seriously and would result in pretty significant discipline if it happened.
One last question I have is, what about the flip side of body-worn cameras, which is citizens fearing loss of privacy, that they're being recorded, that they could be identified, that if the footage is released, gang members might seek reprisals if they cooperated, whatever it might be, they lose their anonymous contact with policing?
It is a concern. And, police departments have had to figure this out. Generally speaking, the position that a police department takes is that if the officer has a right to be there, well, so does the camera. So our expectations for privacy are fairly limited if we're out and about in a public place on a public street or in a park. It gets much more complicated when you think about being in someone's home. being in a hospital, being in a school. Those things get much more complicated, and police departments have had to educate themselves very quickly on not only local but also state and federal law about what's protected and what can be released and when. And police departments have had to figure out redaction technology so that if there is release of footage that's required, that someone in the department is going through and reviewing that entire encounter, that entire video before it's released, and blurring out or some sort of other technology to make sure that that no sort of personal information is released. So it's very complicated.
And let me go back to this North Carolina example. Why pass laws that limit the release, affirmatively limit the release of body camera footage, requiring a judge to sign off on it? What's the policy or the claimed policy that underlies that?
I think that's a huge mistake by the legislature in North Carolina. I'm not even sure what the original rationale is. They've deemed that it's not a public record, and I disagree with that. I think it is a public record, and I think that passing a law at that level really hamstrings police chiefs, mayors, city council, prosecutors in terms of using their own discretion to make decisions about when it's appropriate to release footage. I think that those decisions need to be made at the local level, not at the state level by politicians who oftentimes are having knee-jerk reactions to one particular incident or series of events that I call it crisis-driven reform. You're making changes based on some crisis that happens without thinking about kind of the longer-term consequences of that reform.
Yeah. Finally, you've reviewed all of these various policies. Is there an emerging sense of best practices? I mean, could someone say, give me the top 10 pointers? And I'm not asking you to do that right now, but is there a sense you think of this is the hierarchy, this is what policy should include?
I think there are a couple of, so if I'm a chief of police and I'm just starting a body-worn camera program and I don't have a policy, but I know I need one and I know I need a good one, there are several places where I can go to get started. And there are police leadership organizations that have model policies. So the International Association of Chiefs of Police, IACP, which is the major police leadership organization in the U.S., they have a model policy. So does the Police Executive Research Forum. The ACLU, I can go look at what the ACLU says should be in a policy. And of course, I can always contact my colleagues in police departments, nearby who already have cameras. And then, of course, the work that we do with the U.S. Department of Justice. Again, like I said, we leave the specifics of the language to the local agencies. But what we do is we make sure that any agency that gets federal money, their policy has covered all of the most important bases. And those are the places that I would go to, or I would recommend going to for a chief who's just getting started.
So to sum up then, it sounds like body-worn cameras have two benefits. Number one, it reaffirms good policing and good judgment. It gives an objective record of what happened to support an officer's in the field judgments. And number two, it helps hold bad cops accountable if they are abusing their powers or using excessive force. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think those are two really important points. And I guess a third and fourth point I'd add to that one is the community demand. This train has left the station. Citizens throughout the United States now expect that police officers will have body-worn cameras. And if they don't, then there's some sort of controversial incident, the chief's going to have to answer for that. So the community demand is the other, and then the fourth is the evidentiary value that this footage has for 4 police departments in terms of resolving complaints, 4 prosecutors, 4 judges, 4 juries.
Interesting. Excellent. Thank you very much. This is Professor Michael White from Arizona State University talking about police body-worn cameras, a topic which is more timely and newsworthy than ever. Thank you again very much.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.